Project management students, today we're going to be talking about project cost management. If you will recall, cost is one of the triple constraints of project management alongside time and scope. I think it's probably also one of those elements that more managers and organizational leaders with are concerned than just about anything else. We want to make sure that we're spending money to make money, or that we are, at least if we're in the nonprofit sector, making responsible use of funds. Actually, responsible use of funds makes sense in any organization that spends money. So we're going to be talking a lot about project cost management, how that ties into sound project management principles. So what are our learning objectives? Well, first we're going to talk about why we manage costs in the first place and why it's important. We're going to be hitting a lot of the core concepts and also be talking about specific IT project management concepts. Keep in mind, because these presentations are meant to be summaries, that a lot of what's covered in the cases in our text we do not cover in depth in these conversations, but to give you the tools to better dive into that content as well. We'll also talk specifically in terms of agile and low profile types of cost management as well. We're also going to talk about the concepts of earned value and project portfolio management. EVM is something you've probably talked a lot about in your finance and accounting classes if you've had those. We'll also talk about how project cost management can be controlled or at least managed through the use of project management software as well. So why is project cost management such a hot topic? Well, it's a hot topic in general, but in particular it's a hot topic with IT projects, because IT projects, as we've seen repeatedly in our text, have been an eyesore for managers. They tend to run high on cost. They tend to get out of scope. We always end up spending more money on them than we think we're going to spend. Why is that? Well, I think part of it, if I may digress, is so much of our IT industry at this point is powered by agile types of approaches. Now, you may say to yourself, don't we advocate for agile? Yeah, well, yes, we do. But we also, to give you an example, how many times in the last week or last month have you had to download patches for your Windows operating system? Meaning the product was not complete when it was issued. We tend to view technology as a moving target, and we've grown a culture where we accept the idea that our technology is not perfect from the moment we buy it. So I think that there's been a bias in the technology industry in general to think that costs are a moving target, and that's an excusable approach to basically say costs should have wide amounts of variance and we should just expect to pay more than we budget. I don't see that as something that we can view as acceptable in the long run. And as technology becomes more mature and a bigger part of our projects and our organizations, we in general are going to have to get better at estimating costs. So there's a reason why project cost management is so important in the IT business and beyond. So I love this example that we have the UK, for example, that decided that they were going to modernize their healthcare systems with electronic patient records and the like. As a result, we ended up with incompatible systems, and the organization, the British health system, spent $26 billion over what they had budgeted. I can't even imagine what the actual cost ended up being for the system. Ultimately, by 2011, these were all considered to be sunk costs. The money was spent and very little productivity was gained. Don't put yourself in this situation. So what do we mean costs in the first place? Well, it means we're spending money. So we measure money in units, whether we're measuring them in dollars or whether we're measuring them in millions of dollars. We're spending money. We're spending company resources to buy goods and services. And if we're looking at the IT industry, for example, we could be buying hardware, we could be buying software, we could be paying for consultants, areas that cross over with other project management areas, such as contracts and human resource management. But we're spending money, so we can see why we'd want to track it. So what is project cost management? Well, project cost management goes into a number of areas, whether we are planning how we're going to manage our funds, whether we're estimating what a particular project is going to cost, determining what our total budget should be. And by the way, that can be a very difficult number to ascertain, because in addition to firm fixed costs, things like buildings or computers, we've got variable costs like people that we need to be able to put into that equation as well. So determining the whole budget can be a big math exercise. Finally, well, not finally, but as another major part of this, controlling how we spend, controlling who's working on the project. No matter what industry you're in, generally speaking, the most expensive part of any project or any organizational effort is people. So how do we control those costs as well? Here's a great example of how all these areas fit under project cost management, the related inputs, tools, and outputs. You're going to be relying on a lot of expert judgment in all of these areas because it's sometimes difficult to determine what things are going to cost. The analogy I like to use, when you go to a mechanic to get your car fixed, if you are not a mechanic, you are relying on that person's expert judgment to tell you what that brake job is going to cost, or to tell you what it's going to cost to fix your transmission. What that message to us is, we should be more informed so that when we are in these situations, we can more effectively see if we are being taken for a ride or not. But the bottom line is we rely on expert judgment in all of these areas to know how to do these things. Now, in terms of some of the other tools that we're going to be using, project management information systems and software, different types of data analysis, we start talking about things like EVM, and also being able to determine how much things are going to cost in the first place under estimate costs. Again, all of these are knowledge areas to be considered when we're getting into project cost management. So what are some of the principles? The principles basically are the basic tenets of business. And if you've ever taken a basic business class, these are terms that should be familiar to you. You know, if we are making a profit, once we take the money we've earned, the revenue, and we take the amount we've spent away from it, we have our profits. So if you're operating in a negative, if you're operating in the red, for example, that might be just fine under certain scenarios. Big companies like Amazon.com operated in the red for decades before they became profitable. That may not work for you in a smaller for-profit company, for example, or a nonprofit. You might want to at least break even. So what's our profit margin? If we look at how much we're spending versus how much we are making, that's our profit margin, our ratio of profits to revenues. Life cycle means from the time we start a project or a phase to the time it's done, what is the entire cost? So what is for the life cycle of the project from pilot to completion, what are we looking at? And cash flow analysis, what are we spending versus where are we getting and where's the money going? In the course of the project, if you are in planning, you should be spending probably less money on actual staffing than you are in execution. When you're in execution, that's when you're spending resources and money very quickly. So where's the money going? So it comes down to knowing, for example, if we have a return on investment or not. And one of the big tricks that a lot of organizations are discovering, it's very hard at times to quantify things like information systems into return on investment. So, for example, if we're putting in a new productivity piece of software, if we're going to a project management enterprise system, how do we determine if that system has paid for itself? What criteria do we use to determine if there has been a return on investment? If you don't have a common speak to be able to determine these things, you may never be able to figure out whether or not you spent good money or bad. The point is, there are financial measures and there are other measures as well. So in an organization, if we're saying that we've had improved user satisfaction, could that go into part of our ROI? It certainly could. Most CEOs and CFOs, however, want to see numbers. They want to see that you have produced something that has been useful and can be documented from a financial standpoint. So the bottom line is a lot of organizations don't actually track ROI from any kind of detailed or consistent measure. So in addition, there have been companies that have come up with different layers of what they consider return on investment. I know that our book, for example, likes to talk about things such as green. They like to talk about how green types of approaches, environmental approaches, can pay dividends for companies. What this also means is that if you are investing in these kinds of technologies or approaches, have a way to show efficacy. For example, Walmart uses a lot of solar panels, for example, and an open air or open windows to supplant their lighting, so they're not expending as much energy. Although they often get maligned as selling products that are not good for the environment, in many ways, Walmart is one of the most environmental corporations in the country. So again, it comes down to how you measure ROI, and it's not always strictly on profit. Although, if you're saving money on electricity, you're saving on the bottom line. So what are some of the other basic principles of cost management? Tangible costs are easy to measure. They're things that we can measure in dollars. For example, did we make more money because we were able to manufacture using fewer supplies? That is tangible. Intangible costs are things that are not so easy to measure. Did the new manufacturing methodology disgruntle employees? Were people not happy with it? Did it ultimately take longer to train people how to use it? Direct costs are things that we can attribute to the cost of a product or a service of the project. In other words, a direct cost, if we are buying a new software package for the entire university, would be the licensing fee for that software. An indirect cost is not so easy to calculate. Indirect costs can be things like office expenses, lost productivity if you're training people on a new system, for example. They're harder to track. When you have spent money in the past on a project, we refer to that as sunk costs. When we're taking on a new project, we do not put sunk costs in. For example, if we're starting a new software system, we decided we're going to redo our company intranet, and we realized that the last time we did this, we lost $6 billion. Don't include that on this project. So once you have sunk it, you have written it off, do not include that in your project. So when we're starting a new project, we do not include sunk costs. So some of the other things to think about. Learning curve theory also means that the more you do something, the better off you get at it, the better you get at it, I should say, and the more quickly we're able to accomplish tasks. We also have a concept of reserves, which means if we've got areas where it's difficult to predict cost, we can put reserve funds in. You budget those, meaning you hope you don't have to use them, but you've got them if you need them. This is a smart move anytime we're talking technology. I know some groups that have actually doubled the size of project costs to be able to accommodate for the idea that the technology will cost more than predicted. You're lucky if you're in an organization that gets that, but we've got contingency reserves, which means we include those in the project cost baseline, and that means, for example, we may include a 25% contingency reserve on top of the budget for unexpected expenses. And we call those known unknowns, meaning the computers could cost $50 or they could cost $100 each for RAM. We're not exactly sure, but we know we're going to need the RAM. Then we also have what we call management reserves, and those are unknown unknowns. For example, anybody who's ever done a software upgrade sometimes realizes in the middle that you need middleware that maybe you didn't think that you needed or did not anticipate. So contingency reserves are anticipated potential expenses. Management reserves are for unanticipated potential expenses. So it's good to have your project sponsor and your stakeholders involved in this, especially if they're folks who can free up budget funds. So some things to think about. If you are somebody who's gotten into project management, you may not have a math or finance background. If you have a chance to take some sort of a finance class or at least a crash course to be able to speak in the same language as your finance people, they will appreciate it. And here's the other thing too, I'll tell you from somebody who had to manage a lot of smart people in his time with disciplines who are outside of my own. Taking the time to get to learn somebody's discipline and speak with them can score a lot of points. Listen to people, learn from them, learn from their areas of expertise, and they will help you navigate. The more you learn to speak somebody's language, the better chance they're going to be willing to help you when the time comes. So how do we plan cost management? The first thought is to try to determine, well, what are expenses going to be like throughout this project? So the things that we use, the tools and techniques, with expert judgment. So for example, if you're designing software, somebody who's a software engineer should be on your team. Analytical techniques, how do we actually analyze the costs? And meetings, how do we discuss these areas? So we can discuss the potential ways in which a project can unfold. So our project management plan, again, the Bible that guides our entire project that we talked about way back in project integration management, means how accurate are we going to be? Are we going to be doing, for example, the old 30,000 foot estimate? Or are we doing something that is down to the decimal point? In terms of unit of measure, are we operating in tens of thousands of dollars or dollars, depending on the size of the project? What about the organizational procedures? So do we know, for example, that we have to do 3 bids for anything over $5,000? That gets us into procurement as well. What about control thresholds? At what point do we need to report that we're seeing a loss, that we're spending more money than we thought we would? What about rules of performance management? So how often do we have to report in to our hierarchy on how the project is going? Are we doing paper or digital types of reports, or if we're using a specific piece of project management software, something like Basecamp, for example. And process descriptions, how does the money move? How do we go about getting access to those contingencies or reserves? So in terms of estimating costs, think about this. Whenever we're building a house or we're building an IT system, we always want to be able to have some level of prediction for what things are going to cost us. And there are several types of cost estimates we're going to talk about from the less to more detailed, some tools, and some of the problems associated with trying to determine cost. So rough order of magnitude, we also refer to this as back of the envelope math back in the day, meaning if you were talking through a project with someone, you might have an old envelope or piece of sales literature just sitting around that you would use to write your math on. Rough order of magnitude means we're looking 3 to 5 years out, and we have an estimate. So why do we do this? To determine if we really want to take on this project in the first place, or if it's worthy. And the range of accuracy in this can be minus 50% to plus 100%, meaning the project could literally cost 100% more than what we're originally estimating. Then we get to budgetary, which means we are starting to ask for dollars for this project, and we are talking 1 to 2 years out. You start getting to a higher level of accuracy then, minus 10% to plus 25, and then definitive means that you are in the process of getting ready to go into project deployment, into actual project work. You would be minus 5 to plus 10% accuracy on that as well, and a definitive budget when you're getting ready to go into project execution. So in terms of cost estimates, it depends on your organization and your area, for example. And for example, the Association for the Advancement of Cost Engineering has that you have order of magnitude, conceptual, preliminary, definitive, and control types of estimates. More detailed, for example, than the estimates we just talked about. But repeatedly through the project, you're probably going to have to re-estimate costs, even if you budgeted. Say, for example, we budgeted 3 years ago that we're buying smartphones for our salespeople. Well, the iPhone that's out today probably costs more 3 years from now because it'll have additional features. So we have to have some flexibility from the get-go to know that our project costs may be higher, number one, but number two, to be able to make those estimates more accurate as we go, to redo the estimates as necessary as well. Other things to consider, that we should be able to have estimates we can apply to other projects, because chances are if we're doing this technology on one project, it could end up appearing on another. And when we look at the project as a whole, I'll say this repeatedly, no matter what industry or what kind of project, the most expensive part of most organizations and or projects are people. People cost more than just about anything else. So a large part of any project, even if it's a technology project, will be the associated people. So here's an example about what we refer to as FTE, full-time employee or full-time equivalent. That means full-time employee or full-time equivalent accounts to how many people working 40 hours a week you have working for your organization. And that's a term that people confuse a lot of the time. If you've got two people who are both working 20 hours a week doing the same job, you've got one full-time equivalent. It's been a term that a lot of people have had to get familiar with the last few years for things like the Affordable Care Act, which doles out penalties based on organizations that are not providing health care to individuals based on total number of full-time employees. But you look at the way the project rolls out, the amount of full-time people tends to be highest right during execution. Year 3 of this project, when we're in the thick of it, is when we have the most number of people working at any given time, meaning your staff costs are also going to change over time. So what are some tools or techniques that we have for estimating costs? We refer to the 30,000-foot estimate, the 30,000-foot view. Picture yourself in an airplane looking down at a property and considering building a house. So you could do what we refer to as a top-down estimate. An analogous estimate is also another way to put this. So we're thinking about analogous or top-down means that we are thinking about a project that we have done before, and we're going to use that as the basis for this project. Well, the last time we did a system upgrade of this magnitude, it cost us $50,000. So that's a pretty good estimate for this project. Then we've got bottom up, which is the most detailed way of doing this, where we actually start with things like our work breakdown structures and build up from the lowest level, the work packages, on our WBSs and go from the bottom up and build the estimate. Then we've got what we refer to as a three-point estimate, which means let's look at the best worst case scenarios and the one that might fall out in the middle, the most likely, and that's a three-point estimate. And then we've got what we refer to as parametric estimates. A great example of that would be if you're getting into building costs and you're saying on average a building costs this much per square foot. That would be an example of a parametric estimate. So based on the size of a project or an effort, you would estimate the cost. So what are the problems? Well, we all try to get our work done more quickly. Sometimes we don't anticipate all the details. And this is one of the big ones we get into project management. Nobody wants to come in and give the boss a big figure that he or she's going to have to spend. As a result, we tend to underestimate costs because we want to look good to our bosses, that we're getting them good deals and bargains, and we all tend to underestimate what things are actually going to cost. By the way, guys, that's one of the reasons we put contingencies in the first place. Management, on the other hand, although they may growl and throw things and be unhappy when we come in with high cost estimates, in the long run, if we could learn to be honest with each other, they might appreciate us a little more. Instead of yelling at us that we're asking for too much money, maybe they could learn to appreciate that we're trying to be accurate. So ultimately, management can't create more funds out of thin air, however, and in the long run, management will want you accurate estimates to be able to accurately determine costs. So what are some ways that we can develop cost estimates? I know, for example, and several of these slides refer to a case in our text. Hopefully you're using the correct edition, the 9th edition. There are lots of wonderful tools out there, whether you're using Surveyor Pro or other types of cost estimating software, to be able to determine costs. The bottom line is the more accurate information you can throw into the model, the better the model can treat you. And so get as much information as you can. There are labor costs you may also need to consider. For example, if you're doing a project for the United States government, it may require what we refer to as Davis-Bacon rates. If you've not heard of that before, that means you've got to pay union levels or area industry pay rates for the work you're doing, even if you're not a union shop. So those are examples of where you might need additional information. Again, nice screenshot from our text as well that shows how some of the work breakdown structure items that can be imported for something like Microsoft Project can be converted into costs as well, and so on and so forth. So what are some best practices? I think we start talking about Agile. One of the points I hope that you're getting from this text, if you're in Agile development, you're more rapidly re-estimating costs. Although this can be a pain, on the flip side, you're getting accurate up-to-the-minute costs, meaning you're paying for things as you are going, and you have a more careful, more up-to-date view of expenses. The flip side is that sometimes projects can be more expensive if we're not able to do long-term investments. For example, if you're doing telecommunications contracts, some companies, if you're doing mobile or wireless or broadband, will give you discounts for multiple-year contracts or for multiple-year subscription services to software services. For example, these are things you might not be able to do in an agile environment where you're changing things so rapidly. So how do we determine the budget? One of the best places to start are the activities from the work breakdown structures, and we establish what we refer to as a cost baseline, which means we have some idea when we start the project what it's going to cost so that we can measure against it. That's not to say the baseline won't have to change and be readjusted. But for example, if we did all of our initial estimates and we believe our house is going to cost us $500,000, nice house in Central PA, that we have something to start with to know that that's the number we're working toward. Here's an example again of using a program like Surveyor Pro to create a baseline. We've got, for example, different months, the amount we're paying people in different months. For example, the project manager is getting a steady fee of $8,000 a month for this project work. Not a bad salary, if I do say so myself, for project management, especially for somebody right out of school. That's a pretty good salary. So what about controlling costs? Well, obviously we've budgeted. We want to make sure that we're executing, that we're paying our bills, but that we're not paying too much, that we are controlling what we're spending. Well, how do we do that? We monitor where the money's going. We monitor who's getting paid. Have we stuck with our baseline? Have we had to adjust it? Have we had to start dipping into some of those contingency funds, for example? And there may also be places where, depending on how your organization is set up, where you need to get stakeholders or project sponsors to sign off at specific areas, for example. The tools and judgment here that we're talking about, tools and techniques, I should say, are expert judgment, analysis of the data. This is the spend rate we have versus where we're actually at, and how much more time it's going to take to complete the project. Are we burning our expenses at the right rate? The way we do this is through earned value management, one of the most popular tools and techniques. Now, over the next few slides, we're going to show you some calculations. We're going to show you some formulas for calculating this stuff. But the bottom line is that we're getting most of the information somewhere from our work breakdown structures. We know these are tasks and expenses and items we had to get because we put them in our work breakdown structure, which is part of our project plan. So what we have to do is start off, number one, with a baseline, so we know what our original plan was and if we made any changes that were approved by our change board, for example. And the three values that we need to be able to calculate are planned value, which is how much we think we're going to have worth in our project. What's the planned value of the project work? What did we actually spend, and how much value did we earn? So we planned that we would have a return on investment of $8. We actually had a cost of $7, so we can calculate our earned value. So we made $1 more than we thought we would, and we'll show you how these actual equations work. So, for example, we have our earned value was $5,000. We planned that we would have a planned value of $10,000. Our actual cost was $15,000. So our cost variance is screwed up to begin with because we have $10,000 more that we spent than we anticipated. Our scheduled variance was $5,000, and that gives us our calculations. Now we'll show you how we made these calculations in this next range of formulas. So whether you're trying to determine earned value, cost variance, schedule variance, you can read these for yourselves. These are all ways to determine value, whether or not we are hitting the mark. So our schedule performance index means, are we actually moving at a reasonable rate? Are we performing well based on where we've budgeted? Our estimate at completion means what kind of value are we going to produce when the project is done versus how much time it's going to take for the estimate to complete. So some concepts to think about. Cost variance is simple. It means what we earned versus what we spent. Schedule variance means the value that we created versus what we planned it would value. So the schedule variance basically says how much did we miss the mark or how much did we exceed our own expectations. Our cost performance index is the ratio of how much value we earned to what we actually spent. Schedule performance index means basically how much earned value that we had total versus what we plan we have. Estimate at completion means the estimate if we were completing the project based on how well we've done so far, what's it going to cost us to finish this project. And the complete performance, TCPI, the to complete performance index, means that we are measuring the cost performance that must be achieved with what resources we have left to meet a specific goal. In other words, if you haven't hit the goal yet and you're behind schedule, how much harder do you have to work to get there? Our book does a nice job of tying these together. For example, simply reading this chart, our estimate at completion, if we've got a point that hits to the right of the budget at completion point, we mean what this chart is telling us basically is we are over budget and over schedule. Not a good place to be. So in terms of EVM, it's a pretty well globally recognized standard. We see it a lot in places like China, and we also see it in a lot of Department of Defense projects where this stuff can get dicey. If you get into cultures, for example, who have less regard for schedules, for example, it can be very tough, and a lot of private companies don't make much use of it so far. So, and again, if we look at defense versus private industry, defense, generally speaking, has been a wider adopter of EVM than some of private industries have. Then we get into project portfolio management. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide other than to say if you're managing multiple portfolios, it makes sense, for example, managing multiple projects in a portfolio, it makes sense to manage them in an integrated fashion, because chances are some of the resources you're using for one project and one of your projects can also be applicable to other projects as well. For example, if you're using a new project methodology in one software development project, it may also bear fruit to use it in other places as well. If you've got people who are trained on one project that's similar to another, that could also reduce your overall costs. So the better that you're able to coordinate what resources are required for which project in your portfolio, the better you can manage your entire portfolio. For example, the project management software, as you've been seeing through our text, gives us all kinds of methodologies to be able to track costs. One of the great things too, if you've got a well-run company and you're using some kind of enterprise-level project management software, whether it's Microsoft Project or even products such as Basecamp, they can integrate with your project process, but also things like finance and accounting, meaning real-time updates, what kind of money you're spending and how much you're spending. Things, for example, like EVM can be calculated in real time. And if you've got people committing to doing real-time project management for things like your work breakdown structure, for example, can generate very useful information in real time. So the software industry itself, in terms of people who are using project management software, are growing more quickly all the time. And you can find plenty of articles on the net that will back up that statement. So what are things to think about? Again, I think the kind of the generic answer is that if you're doing any kind of project management using agile methodologies, in terms of costs, you're going to be getting more frequent feedback and you're going to be adjusting as you go. You may have needs for more frequent estimates, and you may also have more requests from people such as your Scrum Master to be able to get more frequent cost and data and information. So to summarize, these are the key areas we look at in project cost management, and as always, using software can be helpful. Guys, thank you so much for your time and attention, and I look forward to our further interaction.